Hello and welcome to Point of View, where we give students a place to listen, learn, and lean in. I'm your host, Avery Wilson, and today we'll be talking about the serial killer Robert Hansen. Before we begin, this episode may be disturbing to some members of the audience. This episode discusses themes of assault, murder, and generally other unsettling themes. Listener discretion is advised. Robert Hansen was born in the year 1939 into a family of overbearing parents and unfortunate amounts of acne. So much acne, in fact, that he referred to his face as one big pimple. As a result of this, he was shunned by the other kids in school, causing him to seek a hobby that he could pursue in solitude, not wanting to deal with the constant stresses of interacting with those who would stress him out. Hansen eventually came upon hunting, as well as tracking animals such as wolves, sheep, or even bears, which would later provide him the skills he needed to perform his horrific events. Notably, whilst he was pursuing his hobby of hunting, Hansen was still forcibly employed at his parents' bakery the entire time. When Hansen graduated in 1957, he enlisted in the Army Reserves for about a year before he was discharged. Along this time, he continued to work in a bakery where he was having trouble with his community and felt as though he needed to take action on his thoughts, which were often filled by rage. This led Hansen to burning down a school bus garage. He was caught for this after his 16-year-old coworker had reported him after he had asked him for his help in the crime. At the time, Hansen was married and, when convicted, sentenced to 3 years of prison on charges of arson. Because of his arrest, his wife was morbidly embarrassed, which led her to filing for a divorce. After serving 20 months of his sentence, he was released, but through prison, he had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Despite being diagnosed, no action was taken to help him after his release, and all of his prescriptions he had been taking were terminated. About 6 months after his release, he remarried and decided it was time for a fresh start, and moved with his family to Alaska. He became quite successful around this time as he had opened his very own bakery and was even becoming almost famous in his area for his high-achieving hunting skills, where he would win trophies for his hunted animals. Around 1971, he began to have a fascination with flying and even purchased his own plane as a result of taking lessons. Unfortunately, this aided his horrifying future. In 1972, Hansen was first arrested for the abduction and assault of a housewife, which led him to being sentenced to 6 months in prison. Despite serving time, he continued to be involved in crimes relating to theft. One example was that he was arrested for stealing a chainsaw and sentenced to 5 years in prison. When Hansen's case was being looked over by the judge had ruled that 5 years was too harsh of a sentencing and overturned it. Because of this, it granted him the time to really begin his evil killings. Hansen's main targets were prostitutes and exotic dancers, as he felt they were disruptive to society and shouldn't have a voice. Hansen would entice these women and eventually pay them up to $300 to follow him anywhere he wanted. He would usually hold them at gunpoint, lead them to his plane, and after capturing them, he would torture and assault them to the point where they had no way of escaping, where he would then set them free in the forest and hunted them like it was a game, similar to how he would hunt when he was younger. By 1979, suspicion began to grow around the missing victims, and even Hansen became tired of his hunting games, but this did not stop him. In 1983, Hansen began to lure his victims through ads in magazines and newspapers, where he would repeat his torturous ways, but within the walls of his house. Because he was a hunter, he adored trophies, and after winning so many for animals, he decided to collect what he called human trophies. These consisted of objects that were significant to his victims. He would keep these in his basement, and they represented the collection of crimes he was able to achieve without getting caught. One of the most significant that he had was a fish necklace that was custom made for one of his victims. Eventually, he realized he messed up when one of his victims, a 17-year-old, was able to escape, which started his ruin. By 1983, the baker would finally see consequences for his inhumane hunting trips. The escaped 17-year-old went to the police and let them know about the horrors she had been made to endure, and immediately a warrant went out for his name. He had previously been suspected of murdering 4 different women from 1980 to 1984, but no definitive technology was able to tie it to him. But his runway was enough for investigators to finally convict him. October of 1983 would see him arrested by Alaska State Troopers on 4 counts of murder before he was held and interrogated in their possession with intentions of pinning him on the other suspected crimes. He wasn't insistent that he hadn't murdered those 4 women, but in February of 1984, he finally broke. Hansen pleaded guilty to the 4 murders he was arrested for, along with a plethora of other felonies, a list of crimes that ended with his admission of murder for 17 different young women. While he was only tried for the 17 murders and associated crimes that he admitted to, by the time investigators closed his case, he was suspected to be guilty of the murder, assault, and abuse of well over 30 women. After a drawn-out legal process, Hansen eventually pleaded guilty to the murders of 17 women after the ballistics at 4 of the crime scenes were tracked back to him. He settled for a plea under the conditions that he would have a low press coverage trial and would only serve his time in prison. By the end of his trial, he was sentenced to 461 years with no parole in the United States Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. He served his time there before being moved back to Alaska in 1988, serving the rest of his time at Lemon Creek Correctional Center. He would serve his time until his eventual passing in August of 2014 at the age of 75. Even after his passing, the impact of his atrocious acts has still not been fully grasped. Only 13 of the women he admitted to murdering have been found up to this point, with some being discovered and ID'd as recently as 2021, and many of the families impacted by Hansen have been unable to find solace since. That was the story of the vile murders of Robert Hansen. We thank you for listening. Once again, we must emphasize that we have nothing but respect for Hansen's victims. Point of View offers our deepest condolences to those who have passed and the families wounded by this man. This concludes this episode of True Crime. Thank you so much for listening, and for a transcript of this episode, head to our Point of View tab on our website, nhsmessenger.org, and follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at NHS Point of View for updates and new episodes. I'm your host, Avery Wilson, and this has been Point of View.